Dr. Hess, thank you for making time today to address our viewers in Albania.
Oh, you're welcome, Keo, and I'm very happy to be here.
I've asked Dr. Hess to focus our discussion primarily on some of the objections to the Old Testament that the critics bring. Given this goal, my questions will be intentionally selective. Before we address some objections, I want to start with this question, Dr. Hess. The Bible seems to be the only book that states that all humans, men and women, are created in the image of God. Could you explain what does this mean and why is it important for us to know?
Yes, it's a very special idea. In the ancient world, some kings regarded themselves as being in the image of a god, but nowhere was the claim made that everyone was created or made or bore the image of God. And there's been a lot of discussion as to what the image of God means and implies, a lot to do with theology and some implications. But if we go back to its first appearance in Genesis 1, we see that it is connected certainly with the creation of male and female, and there is in the image of God a natural connection with other human beings, simply because we are all created in that image. But since it is the image of God, it's also a distinguishing feature from the rest of creation. Animal and plant life are created, but not in the image of God. If we try to understand what the image of God means, it certainly is connected there in Genesis 1, 26 and 27 and verse 28 with the sense of having dominion or rulership over the world, not necessarily to destroy, but as chapter 2 shows us, to work the ground and to create out of it life, to bring that life forth that God had already created. In a sense, it is to maximize the life-giving potential of the garden and then also of the animals, and the man does that initially by naming the animals in chapter 2, which is a means of recognizing what their purpose and function is. But one of the exciting things about the image of God is that we are all created in that image. We all have the capacity in some sense to relate to God, no matter who we are or where we come from. And therefore, male and female, and of all nations and peoples and tribes and tongues, as they used to say in English, we are from that same beginning. We are all therefore equal in our opportunity to come and know God, and should treat one another in that way as well.
I will start with one of the objections now. One of the puzzling ideas in the first pages of Genesis is when it says that after the sixth day of creation, at the seventh day, God rested. Does this mean that God gets tired physically?
That's a good question. The first creation account begins in Genesis 1:1 and goes through verse 4, at least part of verse 4 of chapter 2. And in that creation account, we have a number of major themes, such as the creation of life. God creates all kinds of life, and the creation of humanity, as we've already spoken about, in the image of God. But certainly one of the great themes going through the creation account is day 1, day 2, day 3, up to day 7. There is an inexorable flow in which I believe that God is creating logically day after day after day, but also creating with the move towards the seventh day. Now, it says on the seventh day that God Shabbat in the Hebrew. He stopped or ceased. He no longer worked. It's not because he was tired, it never says that, but it is that he set that day apart. It says he sanctified it and blessed it and set it apart. And there is a sense in which in those 7 days of creation, that seventh day, the climax, the culmination of this whole creation work is that rest. It's not that God needed rest, but that he built rest into creation so that all of creation in his ideal plan would know rest, and that the whole of creation order and history would move towards ultimately rest that he would provide. And we see this in the Bible also, as Hebrews chapter 2 and 4 and elsewhere in Revelation speaks of that rest which we enter into.
Now, there has been other criticism to the creation story. For instance, one of them claims that perhaps God failed with Adam and Eve. Why wasn't he able to create them in a way that they would not rebel against him?
Yes, it's a very good question. And of course, God could do anything, and he could create people who would obey him. But that was not his desire that they would just be forced to obey him. Rather, he created people and gave them this wonderful gift, which is part of the image of God, the gift to choose for God or not to choose for God. The fact that they could choose for God meant that there was the possibility, the potential that they would not. And in chapter 3 of Genesis, we see that first example there, so important in the history of Christian faith and doctrine, that humanity, the man and the woman, did not choose for God, but instead chose to go in a different direction. And that set all of humanity on its course. Could he have created people who would always choose for God, who would always say yes to God? He could have, but then they wouldn't really have been people in his image, those who have a choice, who can say yes, but also can say no.
Another controversial story in the Old Testament concerns the flood at the time of Noah. My question is, was it global or was it local?
Yeah.
In other words, did all human beings except Noah's family and all animals in the whole earth die?
Mm-hmm. It's a good question too. And I wish I knew the full answer to that, because again, we aren't entirely told. Certainly the impression given in Genesis 6 through 9 is that everyone who was created died except those who were in the ark. They alone survived. The land animals and birds and those who were the human family of Noah. But it is possible that in my way of thinking, and given the language of the text, that you could here have a local flood, but with universal impact for the human race and for the animals. That is, that what God had created had not yet extended over the whole earth. I don't know when the flood took place. I don't know how far back in time we have to go to it. But I do believe that there was a universal impact in terms of humanity, and very likely the animal that came aboard the ark.
Now let's address one of the details on that story. Could all those animals that are described in the Bible fit in a human-made ark?
That's an interesting question. I think more people who know more about animals and how they live than I do could answer that better. I suspect that God created an ark that would fit all the animals that he envisioned Noah taking and leading into the ark. And beyond that, I don't really have a strong answer for it.
Yeah. How about the miracles events in the book of Pentateuch? How can we understand that? Events such as the opening of the sea, or the water flowing out of the rock, or food coming from the sky. So are they literal or literary?
Yes, it's a good question. This is a question of how the text and the authors of the text understood what they described. And for this, I think it's important to understand that Hebrew has a very clear language, syntax style in which it describes events taking place. It does this in the books, for example, of Kings, in Ezra, in Nehemiah, and other books where the events are seen by just about all scholars as at least intentionally portrayed as historical, as actually having taken place. So that if you had a time machine and could go back in time and see that, you would see something like what's actually described. Not a symbol, not an allegory, not a metaphor, but something like it. Now, it could have implications beyond the event, but the event itself would have taken place in history and in space. And the interesting thing is that the Hebrew in the Pentateuch is not different when it describes the events. It describes them with the same syntax, with the same grammar, with the same type of expression. It does not suggest that this is symbolic or a metaphor. Other places you will see that. It does that. For example, the famous vision of dry bones in Ezekiel 37. It says at one point, these bones are Israel. And you get the understanding that this is a symbol for Israel. It's not an actual event that took place in history where the bones, the bones come together and the flesh grows back on them and they stand up as a whole army. But we don't have that in the Pentateuch. It is simply presented like all the other events. And there is no stopping right up to the end of the Old Testament in terms of history. So if someone wants to believe that's symbolic or just metaphor and was not intended to take place, they can believe whatever they want, but that's not what the writing of the Old Testament itself suggests when we look at the Hebrew.
There is a miracle event in the book of Joshua when it says that the sun stood still. Now, given the physical laws of nature that we know today, wouldn't it be catastrophic for the human life on Earth if that truly happened?
Yeah, it might well be. I'm not an astrophysicist, so I don't know. Going back and looking at that text in Joshua 10, I believe 12, 13, 14, those verses, it's interesting because the word that's used, it's actually recorded 3 separate times there. Once it's recorded in a poem, once it's recorded by the narrator of the book of Joshua, and once it's recorded or it's quoted from something called the book of Jasher, which we don't know what exactly that is. We don't have the book of Jasher. But in the poem and in the text, it says that the sun, and then it uses a verb, damam, dom, yedom, was silent. That's how it would normally be translated. Now, people have understood that as, well, it could be there was a kind of eclipse, or there was something else going on like that. And I think you could have a broader interpretation, at least in the initial poem, but then by the narrator who's writing that, who goes on to describe it, it does say, and it amad, it stood, and it did not go down for a full day. So the sense is that there was a prolongation in some sense of that day. I think that's the clearest understanding of those different accounts in terms of how they would agree with one another. And of course, the sun being silent could also do that. How that works, I'm not an astrophysicist. I don't know, and I'm not God. God created the whole universe. I take it that he could do a lot of things that would not follow our natural laws of physics in terms of how they would work out. If we believe the Bible, we believe that Jesus rose from the dead. How does that happen? And he had a body afterwards. That doesn't work in the laws of science that we know of, but yet that is fundamental to the Christian claim. So again, I think God, who gives life and is the creator of life from the beginning, is able to do things that we don't always understand.
Dr. Hess, how do you respond to the criticism of the British atheist Richard Dawkins, who has portrayed the Old Testament God as a moral monster? He would claim, for instance, that this God of Israelites is responsible for wiping out the Canaanites, which are described in the book of Joshua. How do you respond to his claim?
Well, I think a lot of times, and he is not the only person, there are many for whom this is a great stumbling block. They see the Old Testament God as a merciless God of anger and wrath. And I think it might be helpful to step back a moment and understand how the Bible portrays God. The Bible portrays God as truly as holy in his foundational characteristics, which means he is different from us. He is different from his creation. And he has certain standards which one must follow or find a way toward to deal with if one is going to approach him. On the other hand, God is also love from the beginning. He is fundamentally love, and love in his attributes, in his relationship, in all that he does. Goodness, he sent his only Son to die upon the cross for our sins. What greater act of love is there than that? And in the Old Testament, he is constantly portrayed as a God of love. In fact, he commands his people to love him. And the loving part of loving is obedience. Now, how can this God do what he does? Well, to some extent, God sets a standard, and he does this in Deuteronomy 20 and elsewhere, where those who have sinned and refuse to leave the land are doomed to death. But on the other hand, what actually happens in Joshua is we don't actually see non-combatants being killed. I'm not saying that never happened. I'm not trying to suggest that. But the idea that Israel went into areas and just wiped out all the men, women, and children who were non-combatants is not so clear in the Bible. If you read it carefully, texts such as Joshua 6 and 8 talk about Jericho and Ai and the people in that. But the way it's worded from man to woman, and we look at this, I look at this in somewhat more detail, doesn't necessarily require that these be non-combatants. In fact, I would tend to see those as primarily forts, fortified by armies that were opposed to Joshua. We could go into more detail and look at some of the other texts here. It's almost on a case-by-case basis. But one of the things that people don't often look at is they don't often look at the larger context. If you go back to Genesis 45, you find this story of Joseph, and he's in Egypt. And it says there's a great famine in the land, not only of Egypt, but also of Canaan. And all of Canaan and Egypt would have perished, except that God worked through Joseph to provide the collection of grain for 7 years of plenty, so that when there was the 7 years of famine, they had that grain. And there's a very real sense in which that text, and in Genesis 50, when Joseph says, what did God mean by, when he speaks to his brothers, by you selling me into slavery and bringing me down here, but the saving of many lives, that if it had not been for Joseph, the whole of Canaan would have perished, as Egypt. And in the following books, though, then we see how the later generations repaid him as they sought to destroy him. It's not that Joshua sought to, or destroyed all the Canaanites. Rather, if you look at the beginnings of chapter 5, the beginning of Joshua chapter 5, chapter 9, chapter 10, chapter 11, what you find is, what you find is the Canaanites all gathered together to try to wipe Israel out, and their allies. They wished to destroy them. And the fact, ultimately, as far as the Bible is concerned, that Joshua did not wipe out the Canaanites, is that you go to the next generation, the generation of the book of Judges, and there are Canaanites all over the place. They're everywhere. They're intermarrying. It's a big problem, but they're there.
In the context of what we have just talked, there are others who describe the God of the Old Testament as the God of wrath, but when they talk about the God of the New Testament, they would say is the God of grace and love. Mm-hmm. Do you think this is a correct assertion?
I tried to address that a little bit, but you're right. There is often a misunderstanding of this, and I think it really is incorrect. I think God is love from the beginning. He creates out of love. Why did he create people except out of his love for them? And I go through many examples of this. How many of the Psalms speak of the heart and compassion of God? How many times the prophets, look at a book like Hosea, Hosea chapter 11, verses 8 and 9, where God says, look, my people, Ephraim and Israel and Judah, they deserve death. They deserve destruction, like the 5 cities of the plain. He mentions Admah, Zeboim, the two of the 5 cities, along with Sodom and Gomorrah, that were destroyed because of their sin. But he says, my heart is turned over within me. I cannot destroy them. I love them too much. I will punish them because I must, but I will not destroy them. And of course, in the New Testament, it's often overlooked that Jesus is portrayed, his final portrayal in Revelation is that he comes as God and as divine to render judgment upon the earth, and ultimately at the great white throne judgment to judge all those who have rebelled against him. So there is certainly the emphasis of love, but there is also the element of what I would call holiness. I mentioned this earlier. There is this sense in which God is both loving and holy from all eternity. It's part of the reason why, as Christians, we affirm the doctrine of the Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, because they have been there from all eternity, 3 persons who have always been in a loving relationship. God did not have to create to love. Love is not a derivative or secondary quality. It is inherent to God, as is his holiness. But these 2 things God is able to balance and get right. We look at it and we try and we fail. We are imperfect. But God again and again shows his love.
I was also thinking about the story of Jonah who went to Nineveh. Wasn't that the point of God's mercy toward the Ninevean people?
Jonah is a wonderful example of God's mercy. Jonah is given this proclamation, 40 days and Nineveh will be destroyed. And the text says that the king and all the people of Nineveh repented, put on sackcloth, and sought God if he would have mercy on them. And again, this is how the Old Testament, and it really gives a background for the New Testament, is so important, that repentance is crucial. But he did. And again he does this. When people do repent, when they do turn back to him, he does have mercy upon them and forgives them and is gracious.
Now, if it is the same God in both Testaments as we are talking, I can't move on without addressing one more question here. Despite that fact, doesn't it seem that there is some differences in the application of some norms or moral values in the both Testaments? For example, in the Old Testament, God seems to have been okay when some of his servants wanted to marry many wives, while when we go in the New Testament, Jesus affirmed a strict monogamous marriage. How do you explain this?
Well, it's an interesting question. In the Old Testament, there are examples of multiple wives being married, sometimes for different reasons, political reasons as well as romantic or other reasons. But even in the Old Testament, at the end of Genesis chapter 2, God creates man and woman, and he says, therefore a man will leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the 2 shall become one flesh. The ideal from the beginning was monogamy, just one man, one husband, one wife, not multiple wives and husbands. And while it occurs in the Old Testament, it also may occur in the New Testament. If you look carefully, there really is not a command anywhere in the New Testament that says you shall only marry one wife. However, the requirements for service in the church, for deacons, for elders, for others, is that they be married only to one spouse. And so certainly if it is not regarded as an absolute command, it is regarded as an ideal as far as marriage goes, that there should be only one husband and one wife. So I don't really see a contradiction there between Old and New Testament.
Dr. Hess, a theory of religion says that at first all human beings were polytheists, that is, they worshiped many gods, and then later they went to a point when they became what is known as henotheists, and that is the elevation of one god above the other gods. And then at a later stage, many people even today will identify themselves as a monotheist, that is, worshiping the only one and true God. Do you think that is the case, or that is the way how the Israelite religion was developed?
Yes, I think that's probably an oversimplification in general, and it does not prove or what happened with Israelite religion. The Bible does suggest that the founder of the Israelite people and so forth, Abraham and Sarah, came from a context that was polytheistic. They worshipped other gods, not only, and may that be suggested in some of the names of their ancestry, but it's also found in Joshua 24, where it clearly suggests that other gods were worshipped. But Abram then had the revelation of one God, and he pursued one God. And then that was reaffirmed during the days of Moses and what followed, according to the Bible. Now, since the God of Israel did not allow any images to be built or made of him, it's very hard to find an image of the God of Israel. In fact, if you find an image, it's probably a false detour from the Orthodox faith that the Bible suggests. But we do know that monotheism, or something very close to it, it's hard to talk about monotheism without introducing concepts of Greek philosophy and exclusiveness, although you do have something like it expressed, I believe, pretty clearly in Isaiah 40 through 47, 48. But the idea of worshiping an exclusive God, one God to the exclusion of others, is already found with the Pharaoh of Egypt in the 14th century BC, where he worshipped one God, the Aten, the sun disk, in Egypt. And after that generation, Egypt returned, and even during that generation, many Egyptians still worshipped other and multiple gods and deities. Some have suggested that that's what influenced earliest Israel, but we don't have any evidence for that. It's simply one example that disproves the theory of an irrevocable movement from many gods to the worship of one God, as though this is the inevitable evolution of religion. And I don't see it at all. In Israelite religion, certainly there are times, according to the Bible's own teaching, when people worshipped many gods. In fact, most of Israel, for much of its history, worshipped many gods, according to the Bible's history. But there always seems to have been those who worshipped a single deity. And as time went on, especially after the return from the Babylonian captivity in the late 6th century, at least in and around Jerusalem, there seems to have been an approach towards a worship of only one God by that population.
As I mentioned in my introduction, my questions will be very selective, given to the interest and the background of our audience. Many of our viewers belong to a Muslim tradition, and so one of the questions is that, or the claims of the Muslim scholars made about the book of Pentateuch and the promises there, especially the promises about that God will raise a prophet like Moses, they will claim that this promise refers to the founder of Islam, Muhammad, and not Jesus Christ. How would you respond to that claim?
Well, the reference to the prophet who was going to come, like Moses, as you said, is found in Deuteronomy chapter 18. And in that text, it does talk about a prophet who will come and speak the truth and lead people into truth. That part could be applied to different people. But it then says that this prophet will come from your brothers, which is often translated from your fellow Israelites, because that's the implication of it. And it doesn't say that once, it says it twice. So this seems to be a very important point. So unless somebody identifies and is able to establish their pedigree or ancestry as within Judaism, and clearly within Judaism, as Jesus did in the line of David, it's very hard to see that any other figure is a fulfillment of that text as we have it.
Dr. Hess, is the belief in the resurrection an invention of the first century Christianity, or does the Old Testament share this belief too?
Yeah, the Old Testament does speak of this, and it already understands this. If we understand the Old Testament perception of the human person, yes, there is the nephesh, sometimes translated soul, and there is the corporeal body as well, but these two things are not separate. They are really united in one. In fact, it might be better to translate the soul, the living being, which isn't really understood as separated from the physical. In the creation story in Genesis and on through the Old Testament, the idea that the physical and the spiritual of the person, the components, can somehow be separated is almost an abomination. It just isn't the way it should be. And the problem is that sin does that. Sin brings death, but sin was not in God's plan from the beginning. But because we have sinned, we die, and our bodies are separated, or our physical component is separated from our living person, that nephesh, or sometimes translated soul. So that's artificial. If there is to be a true redemption, a true renewal, already in the Old Testament it's understood that must be a renewal and redemption that includes the body as well as the spirit or soul, the whole person. So the resurrection is already assumed, I believe, and certainly is seen in many cases on a national level. I mentioned earlier Ezekiel 37, the vision of the dry bones and the idea that these come back to life. That speaks of a national resurrection where Israel went into exile and was cast asunder among the nations, but it will come back and be alive again. But if you look at, I believe it's Isaiah 26:17, that text, which is in a context that talks about the future and judgment, but also about life, about people coming back to life. It speaks of individuals. And then very clearly, Daniel chapter 12, verse 2, speaks of those who are lying in the dust, understood as those who have died, coming back to life with their bodies, with a resurrection. So there is already hints of this in terms of an individual resurrection, clearly spoken in terms of a corporeal or national resurrection, and logically required by the idea of who the human person is, who is being redeemed by God. Full redemption requires the whole person. And we already also see this in hints with figures like Elijah, the prophet, the first of the many prophets who follow after him, who in 2 Kings 2 goes to heaven in a chariot. His body and his soul or spirit are united and joined together. And this is how it should be. But unfortunately, sin has caused that separation. So I think the Old Testament already understood this. And then, of course, the New Testament develops it.
To conclude our conversation together, what is the importance of the Old Testament for Christians?
Well, that's a big question. We could spend a lot of time talking about that. But I really believe the Old Testament is essential for understanding our Christian faith. At the center of our Christian faith is the God-man we worship, Jesus Christ. Jesus Christ is not a first and last name. Jesus is his first name, meaning salvation, because that's what he brings and that's how he was prophesied. But Christ is the Greek Christos, and that is a title. It comes from the Hebrew Mashiach, anointed one, and it refers to the one who is anointed as king in the line of David, and the one who is anointed as priest, the high priest in the line of as Psalm 110 in Hebrews then repeats, Melchizedek, the ancient high priest of Genesis 14. Well, to understand all that, who is this Christ? You have to understand the Old Testament. You have to understand where these things were prophesied, what was expected, and then how Jesus came to fulfill them. Jesus is not simply another God who comes and does some neat things, and so some people follow him. He is at the center of the universe, and the Old Testament sets that up for us to understand and demands that we either then accept his claims as being the fulfillment of the ancient prophecies and therefore the one and the only one who can come and redeem the people, or something or someone else. Added to this is the idea of many ideas such as covenant, such as worship, such as who God is as creator and as one who sustains and intervenes, as loving, as holy. All of these things it is necessary to understand and to believe in terms of the Old Testament. And Jesus himself did this. Jesus used the book of Psalms as his devotional book, his prayer book, his hymn book, and many times he quoted from the Psalms. Even on the cross, he quoted the first line of Psalm 22. My God, why have you forsaken me? Not just by itself, but with the understanding that the whole of that chapter was now going to be implied upon him. But again, without the Psalms and without understanding that, we cannot have that same kind of life that Jesus had in terms of devotion and worship of God. So again and again we find that the Old Testament is a necessary backdrop and background to the New Testament and its fulfillment.
Well, Dr. Hess, as much as I've enjoyed being in your class during my seminary life and seminary time, I greatly enjoyed this conversation today. So thank you for your time and your thoughts.